Here we have the front differential from an E53 X5 BMW. It is known as the VAG 174. When it's split apart, it just comes in two halves. This half has got a pinion in it, and the pinion is set up like so. You've got a bearing down here, a crush sleeve, and another bearing here. And then you've got the shaft up here, which has the flange, a 30 mil socket, nut, and you have a safety washer right here. When taking it apart, you're going to have to knock this back round again because it goes into these little grooves to work as a safety so it can't undo. Then you're going to need a 30 mil socket. It's going to have to be a shallow wall socket, because this just fits a 30 mil chrome socket. You may even have to grind down your socket if need be. Then underneath that, you'll find the flange, which should come off by hand. If not, just hammer lightly from behind it or use a puller if must. Then you'll have this, which is even. Right. And the way this will work is this entire assembly will be in here exactly as it is. And the way you remove that is you get yourself a punch, plop it straight down the middle, and you hammer the other end. That will push it out of here into the main housing, and then out it comes. You'll be left with, in the housing, two races, one there and one there. To get those out, use the same punch, which I now can't get out, and then punch it through that way, and then punch it through that way. And to remove the side races, it's very easy. You just get a screwdriver in that little hole there, and then pry. And it will slowly walk the bearing up to the point where you can literally use your hands and then pull the bearing out. Which I think I'm going to need both my hands to do it. But yeah, as you can see, even by hand, it's come up by that far. The exact same for this side as well. Just a screwdriver in there, give it a little wiggle, up it comes, reach your hand in, rotate it round, and bearing out. There will be a spacer behind there. Same on the other side, there's a spacer there. So when reassembling, make sure you put that spacer back. I'm not going to be replacing this seal because I replaced it not that long ago, but I'll provide you with the part number for this seal if you need it. Because you don't need to break this seal to take the bearing housing out. So if yours isn't leaking, you can skip purchasing this seal. When removing the pinion, you're going to have to remove this seal. And once you remove this seal, it'll be damaged and you'll need a new one. So when you're redoing this rebuild, you're going to have to buy this seal at minimum. Now let's move on to the ring gear set. So you've got one bearing there and one on the opposite side over there. Then you've got your spider gears and your actual ring gear. What you want to do is check it for any uneven wear or damage and see if it's been severely damaged in any way. On these front diffs, it is very unlikely to be damaged, but still something to be aware of. Check the spider gears the same way. Check there's no major damage on any of the teeth. To remove these bearings, you want to cut the outer race, and then all the ball bearings will fall out, and you'll be left with just the inner race and the shaft. You then want to get a bearing splitter on there and use it to pull the bearing off. If not, you can also use a Dremel and cut it most of the way, and then hit it with a hard chisel. That should crack the inner bearing race open, and then you can wiggle it up with a screwdriver. After cutting that, just a pair of side cutters, I've managed to pry this open with a screwdriver, and then I'm going to try and cut this last piece here with the same side cutters. There we are. All the way through, the race will now separate perfectly, and then all the ball bearings shall fall out. Right, to get this off, I couldn't use a splitter, it would not work. I tried over and over again, it just didn't work. So in the end, I cut a slash in the bearing race with a Dremel, and then cracked it open with a chisel and then chiseled it off. That was a pain in the bum to get off. I'm now going to attempt to remove this. I'm going to first try the bearing splitter. If that doesn't work, I'm going to cut a slash in it with the Dremel and then crack it open and then pull it off. And now I've finally got this side off. Again, I tried a splitter, it would not work. In the end, I had to go with a trusty Dremel technique, which involves cutting it at an angle like that, getting a chisel, whacking it in the crack, and then if you look closely, you split it open and then chiseling it the rest of the way off. But I went a little too close and I did damage the actual shaft underneath. Now this makes no difference because once that's over it with a new bearing, it will make absolutely no difference. It's just a slight cosmetic defect that mildly annoys me for doing it, but if you do it yourself, don't worry about it. Just try not to do it, but if you do it, it doesn't matter. Once the new bearing's over there, it's not gonna make a single difference to your differential. And the pinion bearing down here. I've used the Dremel to cut there and there. We'll splay the race open, and then I'm going to use the Dremel on the inner race, cut it at an angle. Be very careful not to touch this, especially do not cut the teeth at all. And then I'm going to walk it up the shaft and I'll be ready for reassembly. It's off. The only way I could get it off was using the old-fashioned Dremel, cut it at an angle like that. Then you chisel here to crack it open and then slide it off the shaft. And there it is. The way I installed this is I stuck the pinion in the freezer and I stuck the bearing in the oven so it goes to 200 Celsius. Then, as you saw in that video, it just slots on. Now moving on to this side of the housing. So you install this race first, and then we'll be installing this race next. To install this race on this side, hold the differential upright, and then with this installer, whack it in all the way until it bottoms out. You know when it bottoms out because it will make a high-pitched ring, and you can even get your hand in there, and you can see as I've already pre-installed it, there is no gap. It is flush with the metal. That's how you know you've installed it correctly. Now to install the other one, it's a little bit more tricky. So what you're going to have to do is line the race up there, get a threaded bar, and get 1 cup on this side, 1 cup on the other side, and then tighten the threaded bar down. And that will slowly insert this one until it bottoms out. You know when it bottoms out because you can see in there's a little gap to ensure you've put it all the way in. But remember, there's also a spacer that goes on this side. So spacer, bearing race, then crush it all down just as I described. And there we are. I've installed the inner bearing race. Now the way I did this is you've got a bearing race press kit. Now I used a threaded bar all the way through there, and then I used an impact on this side here and a spanner on that side to hold it still, and it then slowly pulled it all the way in until it's now bottomed out in there. It was very hard to do that. I had to use an impact and I had to get the exact size just for the outer lip of this inner race, and then I had to get the other bit to sit on the outer of the case. But it can be done. But I'll just give you a heads up, it is tricky, so you know what you're getting involved. A little bit more context. This is how I got that inner bearing race in. This was on the outside, pushing on the outer flange of the actual diff, and this was just sitting on the outer edge of the bearing race. And I put an impact on this end, spanner on this end, and then managed to just pull it through. I tried to do it without using an impact and just do it with 2 spanners. Couldn't do it. It required far more torque than what I could put in it. But with an impact, be careful, and it just, down it went. Perfect. We're going to install this in the main housing. You want to lubricate the bearing, lubricate the sleeve, and both sides of the housing race. Now, once we've slotted this in the housing, I found that this bearing here didn't want to go down far enough for me to be able to get the flange on and actually get any threads to squish it down. So what I had to do is take this bearing here, stuck it in the oven to about 200 Celsius, and then slotted it on, just so it can easily slot on far enough so I've got enough threads exposed to be able to put the flange on and then start torquing it down to the correct preload. You've seated this down far enough, you're going to need to install the new seal. The new seal part number is right there. Then you can install it like so, and then go around with a hammer and just tap it in. To seat this seal the easiest way possible, because it needs to go absolutely flush with the inner lip to be in the right place. If you can get yourself one of these from a bushing press kit, it fits in there perfectly and bottoms out on the inner lip, so you physically cannot push it in too far. Your next step is to install the flange and install the nut. Now you want to make sure, it's very important, that the bearings are lubricated, this one here and this one here. The seal inner lip is lubricated, and you also want to lubricate the nut, because you're putting quite a lot of force down it, you don't want to accidentally strip out the threads. Then, once you've got it all together like that, you have a little bit of preload back and forth. You're going to have to get yourself this tool you see here. Now, this tool is meant for Land Rovers, for rebuilding Land Rover diffs, but it works just the same on a BMW diff. I'll see if I can put a link in that in the description. You're also going to need a breaker bar, a 30mm socket, and then you're going to need this. And this is an inch-pound torque wrench. It's very important you get this to get the correct preload, because the preload for this differential is very small. It's 0.6 to 0.8 of a Newton meter. And it's very important you get that preload correct. Too little and it'll make the same similar noise what it probably makes now, whining noise as the bearings move back and forth. And too high, it will cause too much friction on the bearings and they'll blow through them very quickly. Another little side note on preloading. The preload is very, very, very important. So once you've taken up the slack and you've gone down far enough, the second it starts to read on the gauge, just move it at a mil at a time, go back. A mil at a time, check it again. Just keep doing that until you get within the tolerance of 0.6 to 0.8. If you want to be a little bit cheeky, you can probably push it to 1 Newton meter. Anything beyond that, you've got to take this all apart, get yourself a brand new crush sleeve and try again. So take your time, it's a very important bit. Just take it slow and you'll hit just where you need to be. But you're going to have to use these tools and just take your time. You can't just impact it on, otherwise you'll go from not there, not there, not there to miles past it. Now it's time to rebuild this. So for this, you're going to need 2 of these bearings. I'm going to put them on by heating them up in the oven to 200 Celsius and then slotting them on. You could put them on by using the old race on top of it and stack it and whack it down with a hammer. You could even use a punch. You could even find the correct size socket to just hit on the inner part of the race and then whack it on if you wanted to. But the oven's worked so well for me so far, I'm not going to mess with it. I'm going to try the oven trick first of all. For a little bit more information, this is the part number for the bearing that came out. This is the part number for the race that came out. And the one going in is exactly the same bearing number and exactly the same race number, and made by the same manufacturer as well. One little bit more information. You got to remember that the race and the bearing are paired together at manufacturer. So when you put this bearing on the shaft, put aside the race and make sure you know what side that bearing was, the race was connected to do with, because you cannot interchange this with the other bearing race. They must stay as a pair together. Talking about bearings, these are all the bearings that were inside this differential. The race part number, bearing part number I just showed you. Then you got the internal, the big pinion bearing part number. There's the race. There's the bearing part number. Manufacturers all the same across the board. There's the outer pinion bearing part number and the outer pinion bearing race part number. I'll also provide all the part numbers in the description to make life easy. When you're entering them in, you've got to make sure that both part numbers match, because sometimes some bearings will be this size bearing but with different size race. So when buying them, you've got to make sure both part numbers match. I will list them lined up just as you need to put them in the search engine, but in case somehow you just match the first part number and you don't pay attention to the second, you must pay attention to both part numbers. They must both match before ordering any bearings, otherwise you'll buy the correct bearing but the wrong race, or the correct race and the wrong bearing. So make sure they match. And the crush sleeve that goes inside this differential is the same one found in the Type 168 differential that you find on 1 Series. So I couldn't find the correct crush sleeve for this directly by Googling it. I had to do some research, had to look up, had to make some phone calls, and I found out that the crush sleeve in the 1 Series differential is the exact same for this differential. So I'll see if I can put some sort of information in the description, but I've got no part number for it. I can just tell you where it's located, and if you search for the 1 Series Type 168 differential crush sleeve, you will find options on eBay and around the internet. But if you search for the VAG 174, which is this differential, you'll find nothing about the crush sleeve. There it is, all fully rebuilt with both bearings put on. So 200 Celsius wasn't quite enough to make it slot on beautifully. It required a little bit of encouragement. What you want to do is get yourself the old race, line it up on just the inner bearing race, and then give it a little tap down, and it'll go all the way down until it's completely flush and there's no gap there. Then when you do the other side, you're going to have to make a little platform like that out of one of the other old bearing races, because if you just whack it with it flat on the ground, this outer cage hits the ground first. So as you're whacking the new bearing on that side, you'll be smashing the old bearing on this side. So make sure you put it on like this, a little platform, make a little platform for it, and then 200 Celsius, try and push the bearing on. If it doesn't go 100% by itself, give it a little encouragement with one of the other racers, and you'll be good to go. And then that entire side's fully rebuilt. All you've got to do now is remember to put the racers in the housing, which literally just slot in, but remember they must go with the corresponding bearing. So hopefully you've put these aside and you know which side's which bearing. At the final stage, remember to put a spacer and the corresponding bearing race on that side, same on that side. Then I'd recommend lubricating here, lubricating the ring gear, the bearings, and then you're ready to put the RTV on. So you want to clean both sides of the housing with brake cleaner, isopropyl alcohol, make sure it's no grease, it's dead clean. Then you want to put RTV on this side of the housing, and then put it all together, bolt it down, and the torque spec for the bolts on this are 45 Newton meters. Just one slight correction, reassemble it like this. Make sure you've oiled all the bits, oiled the bearing seals, oiled the races and whatnot, and then clean the surface and RTV it, because I just cleaned the surface, loaded this back in, and made the surface oily all over again. So learn from my mistake. And there you are, fully rebuilt. You torque these bolts down to 45 Newton meters in a crisscross pattern, wait for the RTV to dry, put it straight back in the car. But do remember, there's an O-ring that goes in this gap here. The O-ring that goes there is 39 millimeters in internal diameter and is 2 mil thick. I'll leave the part number for the BMW one in the description, but you're going to have to replace this little O-ring, because once you take this diff off, if you don't have a new O-ring and you just try and reuse the old one, it will leak from here, because over about a space of 2 years at maximum, this O-ring gets completely flattened. And once you take it out again, it will never seal again. So you're going to have to buy that O-ring, but I'll leave you with the part number. And hey, if you've made it this far, please leave me a comment. Did this video help you in any way? Did you find it interesting? Just because I make these videos and it's nice getting some feedback.